There's a peculiar violence in the need to be understood, not the kind that leaves visible marks, but the subtle erosion of the self that happens when you spend your life translating your essence into words others might accept. We live in a world obsessed with explanation, where silence is interpreted as guilt and mystery as deception. But what if the mystic Ibn Arabi was right? What if the very act of explaining yourself is what prevents people from truly understanding you? Picture this. You're in a room full of people, and someone misunderstands your intentions. Your first instinct is to explain, to clarify, to defend. The words pour out of you like water from a broken dam, urgent and desperate. But have you noticed? The more you explain, the less they seem to hear. Your explanations become a noise that drowns out the truth of who you are. This is the paradox Ibn Arabi illuminated centuries ago, a truth so counterintuitive that most people spend their entire lives running from it. Ibn Arabi, the Andalusian mystic and philosopher, understood something fundamental about human nature, that modern psychology is only beginning to grasp. He lived in the 12th and 13th centuries, a time when the world was perhaps less noisy, but no less judgmental. His writings explored the hidden dimensions of consciousness, the places where language fails and true understanding begins. When he suggested that we stop explaining ourselves, he wasn't advocating for silence born of arrogance or indifference. He was pointing toward a deeper truth about the nature of perception and the limits of language. Consider the architecture of explanation. When you explain yourself, you're essentially asking permission for your existence. You're saying, here are the reasons I am the way I am. Here's why my actions make sense. Please validate me. But in that very act, you've already diminished yourself. You've taken the vast, complex, ineffable reality of your being and compressed it into a series of justifications that fit into someone else's framework of understanding. You've become a defendant in a court where you never committed a crime. The human mind is not designed to understand through explanation alone. We understand through experience, through observation, through the subtle accumulation of impressions over time. Think about the people you truly understand in your life. Did you come to understand them through their explanations, or through watching them live, through sharing silence with them, through witnessing their patterns across countless moments? True understanding is organic. It grows in the fertile soil of presence, not in the sterile laboratory of justification. There's a profound difference between being known and being understood. Being known is a surface phenomenon. Someone knows your name, your job, your marital status, your preferences. But being understood, that's something that happens in the wordless spaces between people. It happens when someone sees not just what you do, but why you do it. Not through your explanations, but through a kind of resonance, a recognition of shared humanity. When you constantly explain yourself, you create a strange kind of barrier. You flood the space between you and others with information, leaving no room for intuition, for empathy, for the mysterious process of genuine understanding to occur. It's like trying to help a seed grow by digging it up every day to check on it. The very act of intervention prevents the natural process from unfolding. Ibn Arabi spoke of the concept of barzakh, the isthmus, the in-between space where opposites meet and transformation occurs. When you stop explaining yourself, you create a barzakh between you and the world. In that space, something miraculous can happen. People begin to see you rather than your defenses. They begin to feel you rather than analyze you. They begin to understand you in a way that transcends the limitations of language. But this requires tremendous courage. We live in a culture that equates silence with consent, mystery with manipulation. We're taught from childhood to explain ourselves, to justify our choices, to make ourselves comprehensible to authority figures. Parents ask, "Why did you do that?" Teachers demand, "Explain your answer." Employers want metrics and justifications. We become so conditioned to explanation that we forget there's another way to exist in the world. The anxiety that arises when you stop explaining yourself is instructive. It reveals how much of your sense of self is constructed through others' validation. When you feel that urgent need to clarify, to correct, to justify, what you're really feeling is the fear of existing without external confirmation. You're afraid that if you don't explain yourself, you'll cease to exist in others' minds. Or worse, you'll exist as a distortion, a misunderstanding, a villain in someone else's story. But here's the radical truth. You already exist as a distortion in most people's stories. No matter how much you explain, people will interpret you through their own wounds, their own biases, their own limited perspectives. Your explanation doesn't change this. In fact, it often reinforces it, because people hear your explanation through the same filters that caused the misunderstanding in the first place. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from chronic self-explanation. It's the fatigue of living outside yourself, of constantly monitoring how you're being perceived and adjusting your presentation accordingly. It's the weariness of being your own public relations manager, your own defense attorney, your own interpreter. This exhaustion isn't just mental, it's spiritual. It's the soul crying out for the freedom to simply be, without justification, without translation, without apology. When you stop explaining yourself, you're not becoming uncommunicative or closed off. You're actually opening up space for more authentic communication. You're moving from explanation to expression. Explanation is defensive. Expression is creative. Explanation seeks to control how you're perceived. Expression simply reveals what is. There's a lightness to expression that explanation never achieves, because expression doesn't carry the burden of needing to be understood in a particular way. Think about the people who've influenced you most deeply. Were they constantly explaining themselves? Probably not. They were probably people who lived with a certain integrity, whose actions spoke louder than their justifications, whose presence carried its own authority. They didn't need to explain because they embodied their truth so completely that explanation would have been redundant. This principle extends beyond personal relationships into every domain of life. In art, the most powerful works are often those that refuse to explain themselves. They simply exist, and in their existence, they invite interpretation. They create space for the viewer's own meaning-making. A painting doesn't explain what it represents. It presents itself and allows you to see what you're ready to see. A poem doesn't justify its imagery. It offers language as experience rather than as argument. The same is true for leadership. The most effective leaders aren't those who constantly justify their decisions. They're those who make decisions from a place of deep conviction and then stand by them, allowing the outcomes to speak. They understand that leadership isn't about being understood. It's about being committed to a vision that may only become clear in retrospect. But there's a shadow side to this teaching that must be acknowledged. The advice to stop explaining yourself can be misused as a justification for cruelty or indifference. There's a difference between not explaining yourself as an act of self-respect and refusing to communicate as an act of contempt. The former comes from a place of wholeness, the latter comes from a place of woundedness. Ibn Arabi's wisdom isn't about becoming cold or unresponsive. It's about recognizing when explanation serves connection and when it serves only your own insecurity. True discernment lies in knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. There are moments when explanation is an act of love, when someone genuinely doesn't understand, and a few words can bridge that gap. But more often than we'd like to admit, explanation is an act of fear, an attempt to control someone else's perception of us because we can't tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood. The discomfort of being misunderstood is one of the most underexplored aspects of human experience. We treat it as something to be avoided at all costs, but what if it's actually a doorway to freedom? What if learning to sit with the discomfort of being misunderstood is how we discover who we are beneath the layers of social performance? When you're no longer invested in correcting every misperception, you begin to encounter your authentic self, the one that exists independent of others' opinions. This relates to what psychologists call differentiation, the ability to maintain your sense of self in the face of emotional pressure from others. When someone misunderstands you and you feel that urgent need to explain, you're experiencing a collapse of differentiation. Their misperception feels like a threat to your existence, so you rush to correct it. But a differentiated person can hold their sense of self steady even when others see them inaccurately. They understand that others' perceptions, while sometimes painful, don't define their reality. There's also a profound connection between this teaching and the concept of presence. When you're constantly explaining yourself, you're living in the past and future, referencing previous actions and anticipating future judgments. You're not present. But when you stop explaining, you can actually be here, now, responding to what is, rather than defending what was or shaping what will be. This presence is what allows genuine understanding to occur, because understanding happens in the present moment, in the direct encounter between two conscious beings. Consider the role of vulnerability in all of this. There's a misconception that not explaining yourself is a form of protection, a wall you build to keep others out. But actually, it's the opposite. When you stop explaining, you're choosing a more profound form of vulnerability. You're allowing yourself to be seen without mediation, without the protective buffer of justification. You're saying, "This is who I am and I won't diminish it or package it to make it more palatable." That takes more courage than any explanation ever could. The spiritual dimensions of this practice go even deeper. In many mystical traditions, there's an understanding that the divine cannot be explained, only experienced. God, the universe, the Tao, whatever name you give to the ultimate reality, exists beyond language, beyond conceptualization. When mystics speak of union with the divine, they're describing a state of consciousness that transcends explanation. Ibn Arabi himself wrote extensively about the limitations of language in capturing spiritual truth. He understood that some things can only be known through direct experience, not through description. When you stop explaining yourself, you're aligning with this mystical understanding. You're acknowledging that your essence, like the divine essence, cannot be fully captured in words. You're honoring the mystery of your own being. This doesn't mean you become incomprehensible or inaccessible. It means you become more real, more solid in your own existence, less dependent on external validation. There's a social dimension to consider as well. We live in what some call the attention economy, where everyone is constantly broadcasting their lives, explaining their choices, justifying their existence. Social media has turned self-explanation into a compulsive behavior. We feel the need to caption every experience, to clarify every post, to defend every opinion. But this constant stream of self-explanation doesn't lead to greater understanding. It leads to greater noise. People scroll past hundreds of explanations without absorbing any of them, because there's too much explanation and not enough presence. What would it mean to reclaim silence in a world of compulsive explanation? Not the silence of withdrawal, but the silence of self-possession. Imagine social interactions where people spoke less but said more, where communication was driven by genuine connection rather than the need to be perceived correctly. This isn't a nostalgic fantasy about a simpler past. It's a vision for a more authentic future. The practice of not explaining yourself also intersects with the concept of boundaries. When someone demands an explanation from you, they're often crossing a boundary, assuming they have a right to your internal process. By not explaining, you're maintaining that boundary, saying, "My inner world is mine. You can observe my actions, but you don't have access to my motivations unless I choose to share them." This isn't about being secretive or manipulative. It's about recognizing that you're not obligated to make yourself transparent to everyone who demands it. But boundaries without compassion become walls. This is where the subtlety of Ibn Arabi's teaching becomes apparent. He's not advocating for a rigid refusal to communicate. He's pointing toward a more flexible, responsive way of being in the world. Sometimes explanation serves love and connection. Sometimes it serves fear and control. The wisdom lies in knowing the difference. There's a particular freedom that comes when you stop seeking approval through explanation. Approval seeking is one of the most exhausting human behaviors, and chronic self-explanation is one of its primary expressions. When you explain yourself, you're often asking, "Is this okay? Am I okay? Do you accept me?" But when you stop explaining, you're making a different statement. "I accept myself. Whether you understand me or not, whether you approve or not, I know my own truth." This doesn't mean you become indifferent to feedback or incapable of self-reflection. It means your sense of self-worth isn't contingent on others' understanding. You can hear criticism without being destroyed by it. You can accept that you might be wrong about something without it threatening your entire identity. Paradoxically, by caring less about being understood, you become more capable of genuine understanding both of yourself and others. The relationship between self-explanation and authenticity is complex. We often think that explaining ourselves makes us more authentic, that transparency equals truth. But excessive self-explanation can actually be a form of inauthenticity, a way of managing others' perceptions rather than simply being. True authenticity isn't about explaining your internal process. It's about aligning your external behavior with your internal values and then living with whatever consequences emerge. Consider the role of time in understanding. Some things can only be understood retrospectively. You make a decision that seems strange to others, and no amount of explanation in the moment will make it clear. But 5 years later, when the consequences of that decision have unfolded, people suddenly understand without needing any explanation. They see the wisdom that was invisible at the time. By not explaining, you're trusting in time's ability to reveal truth more eloquently than words ever could. There's also a connection between this teaching and the concept of integrity. Integrity literally means wholeness, being undivided. When you're constantly explaining yourself, you're divided, fragmented across multiple presentations of self, depending on your audience. But when you stop explaining, you can be more whole, more integrated. You're the same person regardless of who's watching or what they think. This wholeness is palpable. People sense it even if they can't articulate it. The psychological literature on impression management is relevant here. Research shows that people who engage in high levels of impression management, constantly monitoring and adjusting how they present themselves, experience more anxiety and depression. They're exhausting themselves trying to be all things to all people. By contrast, people who have a strong, stable sense of self that doesn't shift based on external feedback tend to be more resilient and content. Not explaining yourself is a form of refusing excessive impression management. But there's a developmental aspect to this that can't be ignored. Children and adolescents often need to explain themselves as they're forming their identities. They're trying on different selves, testing what resonates and what doesn't. The constant explanation is part of the identity formation process. But at some point in adulthood, this process should mature into a more settled sense of self. Continuing to explain yourself compulsively into middle age suggests that identity formation stalled somewhere along the way. The cultural context matters enormously. In some cultures, explaining yourself is seen as respectful, a way of honoring relationships and maintaining harmony. In others, it's seen as weak, a sign of insecurity. Ibn Arabi's teaching transcends cultural specifics by pointing to a universal human experience, the tension between wanting to be seen accurately and needing to preserve the mystery of selfhood. How this plays out will look different in Tokyo than in New York than in São Paulo, but the underlying dynamic is the same. There's a connection here to the concept of negative capability, which the poet John Keats described as the ability to remain in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without irritably reaching after fact and reason. When you stop explaining yourself, you're cultivating negative capability. You're comfortable with ambiguity, with being partially understood, with existing in the tension between revelation and concealment. This is the artist's way of being in the world, the lover's way, the mystic's way. The practice of not explaining yourself also relates to power dynamics. Often, the people who demand the most explanation from you are those who have some form of power over you, or those who feel entitled to your transparency. By not explaining, you're reclaiming power, asserting your autonomy. But this must be done with awareness, because power dynamics are real and sometimes explanation is strategically necessary. The key is to distinguish between strategic explanation, which serves a practical purpose, and compulsive explanation, which serves only anxiety. There's a meditative quality to this practice. When you catch yourself about to explain, to justify, to defend, and you pause instead, there's a moment of pure presence. In that pause, you can feel the impulse to explain, can observe it without acting on it, can let it dissipate. This is mindfulness in action. This is what it means to have space between stimulus and response, to be conscious rather than reactive. The teaching also illuminates the nature of projection. When someone misunderstands you, what they're often seeing is their own projection, their own fears or desires or wounds reflected back to them. No amount of explanation can clear that up, because you're not actually addressing the projection. You're trying to present facts that contradict an emotional reality. The only thing that dissolves projection is time, experience, and sometimes the projector's own inner work. Your explanation is irrelevant to that process. Consider the role of mystery in attraction and charisma. The most magnetic people often have an element of unknowability about them. They don't explain everything. They leave room for imagination. for curiosity, for the other person's own meaning-making. This isn't manipulation. It's an understanding that humans are drawn to mystery, that we're more engaged by questions than by answers. When you explain everything, you remove the mystery and with it, some of the vitality of the relationship. But mystery without substance becomes mere performance, a calculated withholding that serves ego rather than truth. The kind of mystery Ibn Arabi points toward isn't strategic. It's natural, arising from the genuine incomprehensibility of consciousness itself. You're not withholding information to be intriguing. You're simply acknowledging that some aspects of your experience can't be communicated, that the fullness of your being exceeds what can be captured in explanation. The relationship between language and consciousness is central here. Language shapes consciousness, but consciousness exceeds language. When we rely too heavily on explanation, we begin to believe that only what can be explained is real, only what can be articulated matters. But this is a profound impoverishment of human experience. The most significant aspects of life, love, beauty, meaning, transcend explanation. They can be evoked, suggested, pointed toward, but never fully explained. There's a connection to the practice of surrender. When you stop explaining yourself, you're surrendering control over how you're perceived. This is terrifying for the ego, which wants to manage, to control, to ensure favorable outcomes. But surrender doesn't mean giving up. It means releasing attachment to specific outcomes while remaining committed to your truth. It's the difference between forcing and allowing, between pushing and flowing. The practice also touches on the concept of emotional labor. Constantly explaining yourself is a form of emotional labor, expending energy to manage others' emotional responses to you. Women in particular are often socialized to perform this labor, to smooth over discomfort, to make themselves non-threatening by over-explaining. Not explaining yourself can be an act of resistance against this conditioning, a refusal to prioritize others' comfort over your own authenticity. But this must be balanced with genuine care for others. There's a difference between not explaining yourself as an act of self-respect and refusing to communicate as an act of punishment. The former maintains connection even without explanation. The latter severs connection. Ibn Arabi's teaching is about the former, about finding ways to connect that don't require constant justification. The digital age has complicated all of this. Online interactions lack the nuance of face-to-face communication, so misunderstanding proliferates. The impulse to explain becomes even stronger because there's no body language, no tone of voice, no shared physical space to convey meaning. But perhaps this makes the practice even more necessary. Perhaps learning to not explain yourself online, to let your words stand without endless clarification and defense, is one of the most important skills for navigating digital life. There's also a relationship to grief and loss. When someone close to you dies, one of the painful realizations is often that they left without fully explaining themselves, without you fully understanding them. But would more explanation have changed this? Probably not. Understanding between people, real understanding, happens in the accumulated moments of shared life, not in explanatory conversations. The grief teaches us that explanation is always insufficient, that we must make peace with partial understanding, with mystery. The practice of not explaining yourself is ultimately about trust. Trust in yourself, that you know your own truth even if others don't. Trust in others, that they're capable of coming to their own understanding without your management. Trust in the process of life. That truth reveals itself over time without needing to be defended in the moment. Trust in the universe, that there's an intelligence at work beyond your control. This trust isn't blind, it's earned through experience, through watching how things unfold when you release the need to control perception. You begin to notice that people who truly care about you will seek to understand you regardless of explanation, and people who don't care won't be convinced by any amount of words. You begin to see that your energy is better spent living authentically than defending your authenticity. There's a paradox at the heart of this teaching. By trying less to be understood, you become more understandable. By saying less, you communicate more. By defending yourself less, you become more secure. This is the paradox of the Tao, of the wisdom traditions that understand that less is often more, that emptiness contains fullness, that the way forward is sometimes the way back. When you fully embrace this practice, something shifts in your relationship with yourself. You stop being your own harshest critic because you're no longer listening to the constant internal monologue of self-justification. You stop living outside yourself, constantly monitoring how you're being received. You come home to yourself in a way that's deeply peaceful. This peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of self-acceptance that doesn't require external validation. The world changes when you stop explaining yourself, but not in the way you might expect. The world doesn't suddenly understand you better. Rather, you stop needing the world to understand you in order to be okay. And in that shift, in that release of needing to be understood, something miraculous happens. The people who are meant to understand you do. The relationships that are meant to deepen do, and the ones that were based on misunderstanding or projection naturally fall away, creating space for more authentic connections. Ibn Arabi's teaching isn't about isolation or indifference. It's about a more mature form of connection, one that honors both your mystery and others' autonomy. It's about showing up fully as yourself and trusting that this is enough. It's about the courage to exist without justification, to let your life be your explanation, to know that if your actions don't speak for themselves, your words won't make up the difference. In the end, the practice of not explaining yourself is a practice of self-love. It's saying to yourself, I don't need to justify my existence. I don't need to make myself acceptable to everyone. I am allowed to be complex, contradictory, evolving. I am allowed to be partially understood, even misunderstood, and still be worthy of love and respect. This is radical in a world that constantly demands we explain ourselves, that we fit into categories, that we make ourselves comprehensible and comfortable. So what happens when you stop explaining yourself? The anxiety rises at first, the fear of being misunderstood, of being judged, of existing without the safety net of justification. But if you breathe through that anxiety, if you stay present with the discomfort, something else emerges. A stillness, a solidity, a sense of being grounded in yourself that doesn't depend on anyone else's understanding. This is freedom. This is what Ibn Arabi was pointing toward. The liberation that comes from releasing the impossible task of making everyone understand you and embracing the possible task of understanding yourself. The world will begin to understand, not because you've finally found the right words, but because you've stopped using words as a shield and started living as a revelation. People understand through witness, through watching you live with integrity, through experiencing the consistency between who you say you are and who you actually are. This understanding takes time, requires patience, demands trust, but it's the only understanding worth having, the only understanding that's real. Stop explaining yourself, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of faith. Faith in your own truth, faith in others' capacity to see, faith in time's ability to reveal what words cannot convey. Live your truth so fully that explanation becomes unnecessary. Be so solid in yourself that others' misunderstanding doesn't shake you. Create space for genuine understanding by removing the noise of constant justification. This is the path Ibn Arabi illuminated, the path of the mystic who knows that the deepest truths cannot be spoken, only lived. The path of the person who has stopped performing for an audience and started being for themselves. The path of liberation from the exhausting need to be understood and the discovery of peace in simply being. And in that being, without explanation, without justification, without defense, you finally become comprehensible to those who are meant to comprehend you. Not through your words, but through your presence. Not through your justifications, but through your authenticity. Not through your explanations, but through the inexplicable mystery of your existence offered freely, without apology, without reservation. This is the understanding Ibn Arabi spoke of, the understanding that emerges not from explanation, but from the silence that follows when we finally stop trying to translate ourselves into something more acceptable and instead simply are. In that silence, in that space of non-explanation, true understanding becomes possible. The world begins to see you not as you've tried to present yourself, but as you actually are. And that, finally, is enough.